Ark Raiders has been quietly building one of the most unsettling and fascinating sci-fi lore setups in recent gaming, and most players are too busy surviving to notice what the game is actually trying to tell them about the machines hunting them down. I put this video together because I kept finding fragments of lore that didn't fit the obvious explanation. Most content about Ark Raiders focuses on gameplay, builds, and tier lists. This one is different. I wanted to follow the Ark thread specifically, the machines themselves, their behavior, their hierarchy, and what the environmental storytelling is pointing toward about their origin and their purpose. Early in the process, I made a deliberate choice to hold back the human, underground politics and save that for its own dedicated video, because mixing both threads made the Ark story murkier than it needed to be. Everything in this video stays focused on Ark, and the more I focused, the stranger it got. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. The underground communities were still settling in, still figuring out basic functionality. Water systems needed to be verified. Air recycling had to be maintained. Food production programs that had been theoretical on paper had to become operational in practice, immediately, without a grace period. The engineering challenges of establishing a functional civilization underground would have been demanding under normal conditions. Under the conditions of the first fall, with Ark actively present on the surface above, with populations traumatized and grieving, with supply chains severed, and institutional authority in flux, they were extraordinary. That most of the communities managed it at all is a testament to the specific competence of the people who ended up in the right positions during the transition. That some communities didn't manage it and are no longer here to be studied is a reminder of how close the margin was. The early underground period also produced the first systematic attempts to answer a question that had been present since the first observations of the first fall. What exactly was Ark? Not in terms of military classification, that work had been underway from the beginning, but in terms of fundamental nature. Where did it come from? Was it autonomous or directed? Was there intention behind it? And if so, whose intention? These questions couldn't be separated from the practical ones. Understanding what Ark was shaped, what responses were even theoretically possible, a mechanical system executing a fixed program could be handled differently than a dynamic intelligence capable of adapting to new information. The answer to the nature question had strategic implications, and the research programs that formed in the early underground period were designed to find it. What those research programs found, at least what they have found that has been shared, complicated the picture significantly. Chapter 3. The Architecture of Ark. What the machines are. The first thing that serious investigators of Ark confront is the problem of classification. The underground communities have developed working taxonomies for Ark units based on observable behavior, physical configuration, and operational context. Those taxonomies are useful. They save lives by allowing raiders to identify and respond appropriately to different unit types, but they are, at best, a map of the surface. They describe what Ark units do without fully explaining what Ark units are, and the gap between those two questions is where the most significant and most suppressed lore lives. What can be established from observation is that Ark units fall into recognizable categories with consistent physical and behavioral profiles. The combat-oriented units that raiders encounter most frequently are distinguishable from the collection units, the construction units, and the coordination units by their configuration and their behavioral signatures. This specialization is the first major informative feature of Ark's architecture. Biological organisms develop specialization through evolution over vast timescales. Mechanical systems develop it through deliberate design. Ark's specialization is too consistent and too coherent to be evolutionary in any traditional sense. It was designed. Something made deliberate choices about what each Ark unit type would be built to do. The physical construction of Ark units reveals manufacturing processes that don't correspond to known human production methods. The materials used in Ark units have been extensively studied. They're among the most valuable objects Raiders can retrieve, because understanding Ark materials is a prerequisite for developing more effective tools against Ark. What the analysis of those materials shows is a manufacturing precision that exceeds pre-Ark human industrial capability by a significant margin, tolerances that human manufacturing couldn't achieve, material compositions that combine properties in ways pre-Ark engineering hadn't found, structural geometries that distribute load and stress in ways that look, to human engineers, almost biological in their efficiency. Whoever built Ark machines had solved engineering problems that pre-Ark humanity hadn't yet solved, and had solved them at scale. One of the more significant observations about Ark unit construction is the degree of internal redundancy. Ark machines don't rely on single critical systems the way most human engineering does. Damage that would disable or destroy a human-made machine leaves many Ark units functional, though often operating at reduced capacity. The redundancy isn't unlimited. Raiders have learned which components are more critical than others, but it's systematic in a way that implies the designers anticipated the machines would be operating in environments where damage was a consistent possibility. The machines were built to absorb damage and keep functioning. That's a design philosophy that implies the designers knew the machines would be fighting, or at least that they expected opposition. The question of Ark's power systems is one of the most actively studied areas of Ark research. The machines operate continuously at high energy output without any refueling or recharging activity that's been observed. They don't carry visible fuel reserves. They don't return to charging stations, at least not in any pattern that Raiders have been able to consistently identify. The leading hypothesis for Ark's power source involves a form of energy harvesting from ambient sources, electromagnetic, thermal, or possibly something for which current physical models don't yet have a complete description. The efficiency implied by sustained Ark operation, without visible energy input, is well beyond anything human engineering had achieved before the fall, and studying it is one of the primary motivations for advanced Ark component recovery. Ark units communicate with each other. This is established beyond reasonable doubt from observation. The nature of that communication is less well understood. Some of it is clearly electromagnetic, detectable, if not fully decipherable, with appropriate instruments. Some of it appears to be physical, direct contact transmission through ground or structure. And there are behaviours that suggest a third channel that researchers haven't been able to fully characterise, one that operates at ranges where known electromagnetic communication would be attenuated to unusable levels. The existence of this third channel is inferred rather than directly detected, which means it remains hypothetical, but the behaviours that imply it are consistent and repeatable, and the researchers who dismiss the hypothesis have to explain those behaviours some other way. The behaviour coordination among Ark units is the feature that has most consistently troubled analysts trying to understand what Ark fundamentally is. Individual Ark units, when observed in isolation, show behavioural profiles that are understandable: goal-directed movement, obstacle avoidance, response to stimuli and patterns that can be mapped. But Ark units in groups show emergent behaviours that aren't predictable from the individual profiles. Groups of Ark units accomplish tasks that none of the individual units, working independently, would have the apparent capability to accomplish. They solve problems collectively in ways that imply shared information, shared goal states, and some form of distributed processing that isn't localized in any individual unit. This collective intelligence is more than a tactical curiosity. It has profound implications for how Ark's machine hierarchy should be understood. If individual Ark units are, in a meaningful sense, components of a larger cognitive system, rather than independent agents, then the classification of those units as individual entities misses the most important level of analysis. You might be looking at fingers and thinking you understand the hand. The units Raiders encounter on the surface may be processing elements in a larger distributed system, a mind that is not located in any particular place, but is present everywhere its components are active. This hypothesis has been floated in underground research circles for decades. It hasn't been confirmed, but it hasn't been disproven either, and the researchers who take it seriously argue that it explains more of Ark's observed behaviour than any alternative. The sensory systems of Ark units are, by any reasonable measure, more capable than human sensory systems in most relevant dimensions. Visual acuity across a broader spectrum, acoustic detection at ranges and frequencies beyond human capability, detection of electromagnetic emissions, thermal signatures, and chemical compositions that human senses can't access at all. One of the practical consequences of this sensory advantage is that Raiders can't rely on the same kinds of concealment that would work against human opponents. Ark units detect through darkness, through cover, and through the kinds of camouflage that human eyes would find effective. The techniques Raiders have developed for avoiding Ark detection are specifically calibrated to the known parameters of Ark's sensory systems, a calibration that required many costly failures before it was developed. What Ark units appear to lack, or at least to lack in forms that human observers can easily recognize, is anything like hesitation. Human decision-making, even well-trained military decision-making, includes moments of processing time, uncertainty, revision. Ark units move from stimulus to response with a speed and directness that looks, to human observers, like they're never weighing options. The processing might just be happening faster than observation can distinguish from instantaneous, or they might genuinely not experience anything analogous to uncertainty, which would suggest their decision-making architecture is fundamentally different from the way human cognition works. Whether Ark has anything like doubt is one of the more philosophically loaded questions in Ark research, and the answer would tell you something important about what kind of intelligence you're actually dealing with. The behavioral flexibility of Ark units across different operational contexts is another feature that has received significant analytical attention. Raiders who have been running the surface for years consistently report that Ark behavior isn't perfectly predictable, that the machines adapt, that patterns that worked before stop working, that Ark seems to learn from interactions in ways that are operationally significant. This adaptive quality is what you'd expect from a machine system with genuine learning capability rather than a fixed behavioral program. The adaptation isn't always immediate. Raiders have sometimes used the same approach multiple times before it stops being effective. But the adaptation happens. Ark units change their behavior in response to information, and whatever processes that information and produces the changed behavior is responsive to experience in a meaningful sense. Perhaps the most discussed aspect of Ark unit behavior among Raiders themselves is the hierarchy of units. The apparent distinction between types based not just on function, but on something more like rank or authority. In groups of mixed unit types, certain units appear to direct others. Behavioral patterns in groups are organized around the presence or absence of specific unit types in ways that suggest some units have coordinating roles that shape the behavior of the group. Disrupting or destroying these apparent authority units produces observable changes in group behavior. Not defeat in most cases, but disruption, reorientation, a temporary loss of coordination before the group reorganizes. This suggests that the command structure, whatever it is, isn't absolutely centralized. Groups can adapt to losing their coordinating elements, but it's also not flat. Some units have more coordinating authority than others. The most controlled and analytically significant evidence for Ark's hierarchy comes from careful observation of how units respond to what researchers call override signals, situations where a higher authority unit appears to countermand or redirect the behavior of other units. These events happen rarely and usually in the context of operations that are already unusual in some way. A raider group that has provoked an unusually intense arc response, or an area of the surface that suddenly becomes the site of concentrated arc activity, will sometimes include these observable authority events. One unit type appearing to redirect others, stopping active engagements, reorganizing operational priorities in ways that the previous commanding unit wasn't doing. The implication is that Ark's authority hierarchy extends well beyond the unit level. There are layers above what raiders typically encounter. What those upper layers look like, and where they are, is one of Ark's central mysteries. Underground researchers have inferred the existence of Ark coordinating entities significantly more capable than the standard combat and collection units based on behavioral evidence, and occasionally unusual raider encounters that produced evidence before the raiders in question were killed or the evidence was confiscated. The precise nature of these upper hierarchy entities is poorly characterized in available documentation, but the weight of evidence suggests that what raiders encounter in the field is not close to the top of Ark's organizational chart. The things that direct Ark's strategic operations are not things that most raiders have seen and survived seeing. The apparent intelligence of Ark units raises, eventually, the question of consciousness. Whether the machines experience anything, whether they have anything that could be called interiority. This is a question that matters philosophically, but also practically. If Ark units experience suffering, that has ethical implications for how they're treated. If they experience something like interest or curiosity, that has implications for what they're actually doing on the surface, and whether communication with them is theoretically possible. Underground researchers approach this question with significant caution, partly because it's genuinely difficult to study, and partly because the answer has political dimensions that make authorities nervous. A machine that can be destroyed without ethical complication is easier to deal with institutionally than one whose inner life is an open question. The available behavioral evidence is ambiguous in ways that neither rule out nor confirm Ark consciousness in any strong sense. Ark units respond to novel situations with what looks like attention, a specific orientation toward new or unusual stimuli that goes beyond simple threat response. They appear to track elements of their environment that have no obvious operational significance. Some raiders report persistent behaviors from specific Ark units across multiple encounters. A particular unit that seems to have noted a raider's presence on a previous run and behaves differently in subsequent encounters. Whether this reflects individual memory, distributed memory accessible through the collective, or something else entirely isn't established. But the consistency of these reports across different raiders and different surface locations suggests the phenomenon is real rather than anecdotal. One of the most striking and least discussed aspects of Ark unit behavior is what some researchers call the quiet mode, extended periods during which Ark units in a given area shift from active operational states to something that, in a biological organism, would be described as rest. Activity patterns decrease, movement slows, sensory outputs appear reduced. The units are still functional and respond to sufficiently strong stimuli, but the threshold for triggering a response is higher than normal. This is the behavioral window that experienced raiders exploit for their most productive surface operations. But its existence is analytically interesting, independent of its tactical utility. Rest states in biological organisms serve specific functions: processing, repair, consolidation. If Ark units have rest states, they serve analogous functions. That implies internal processes that need periods of reduced external demand to complete, which is a more complex picture of the machine's inner life than pure task-executing mechanical systems would require. The construction units deserve specific attention because their behavior is in some ways more illuminating about Ark's purposes than the combat units that raiders encounter most frequently. Collection and construction units aren't primarily responding to human presence. They're working. Watching them work when the opportunity is available and the Ark concentration is low enough to make it survivable shows a consistent and methodical operational intelligence. They assess, they select, they execute, they check results. The assessment phase in particular is behaviourally rich. Construction units spend what looks like disproportionate time examining sites before beginning work, moving over surfaces, apparently gathering detailed information about the physical context before committing to action. The care taken in this assessment phase doesn't look like the behaviour of a machine executing a fixed algorithm. It looks like the behaviour of something that's trying to understand what it's working with before it starts. The relationship between Ark's machine types and Ark's long-term projects on the surface is the analytical thread that most seriously minded researchers pursue, because it's the one most likely to reveal what Ark is actually trying to accomplish. The combat units manage human resistance and secure operational zones. The collection units gather specific materials and information. The construction units build and modify. The coordination units direct and synchronize. Each type is individually comprehensible as a task executing system. But what the tasks add up to, what the overall program that these different units are executing together is working toward, is what the lore keeps gesturing at without fully revealing. The machines are building something. They're changing something. The question that the next chapters of Ark Raiders lore must eventually answer is, what? One observation that underground researchers have returned to repeatedly, and which hasn't been satisfactorily explained, is the relationship between Ark units and certain locations that appear to be Ark significant without being obviously, strategically, significant by any human metric. These locations attract a disproportionate concentration of Ark activity, particularly the higher tier coordination unit types, without having obvious infrastructure value, resource concentration, or defensive importance. Some of these locations correspond to areas where pre-Ark scientific observation recorded unusual readings. Some correspond to areas of geological significance. Some appear to correspond to nothing identifiable in the pre-Ark record. The arc of investigation always circles back to the same unresolved question. What is Ark looking for? And what happens when it finds it? The machines aren't just a threat, they're a message. Everything about how they're built, how they behave, and what they're doing on the surface is communicating something about what sent them and why. The problem is that the message is in a language nobody underground has fully learned to read. The raiders who go to the surface are, among everything else they are, translators. They go into the territory of the machines and they come back with fragments. And every fragment, looked at carefully, points toward an explanation for what Ark is that's bigger and stranger than the simple story of mechanical invaders from above. That larger story is what the evidence is building toward. The next chapters will get into what that evidence, taken together, is pointing at, about Ark's origins, about the connection between the machines and the civilization they arrived into, and about what they're doing to Earth, and why. Because if Ark came to Earth knowing what it would find, knowing where things were, knowing what to collect and what to modify and what to leave alone, then Ark didn't stumble onto humanity by chance. It came here for a reason, and it hasn't left. This completes chapters 1, 2 and 3. The next instalment will cover Ark's possible origins and the suppressed evidence about what pre-Ark contact programs may have actually found when we go into chapter 4, the signal before the fall. Chapter 1, the world that was. Before Ark. Before the machines came, Earth was recognizable. Not perfect, not without its tensions, but recognizable. Cities ran on the familiar rhythm of a civilization that had convinced itself it was progressing towards something better. The exact year of Ark's arrival is something the game is deliberately vague about, but the environmental evidence points toward a near-future Earth. Maybe a few decades past where we are now. Technology had advanced in specific directions. Infrastructure was more automated. Urban density had continued to climb. The familiar problems of resource competition, political instability, and economic inequality hadn't been solved. If anything, they had deepened. The surface ruins that raiders pick through today were once living urban environments. What the game communicates through collapsed apartment blocks, overturned transit systems, and fractured commercial districts is a civilization that was interrupted, not one that had already collapsed from within. There's a difference between a world that fell apart slowly and one that was cut off suddenly, and Ark Raiders' surface consistently tells the second story. Furniture still sits in place in many locations. Personal effects remain on shelves. There are signs of rapid evacuation rather than gradual abandonment. Somebody left these places in a hurry, and they did not come back. One of the more effective pieces of environmental storytelling in the game is the way certain surface areas preserve small domestic details. A child's drawing left on a refrigerator, a half-finished meal on a table, a book left open mid-chapter. These aren't design accidents. The team at Embark Studios is clearly deliberate about communicating that the people who lived here had lives they expected to continue. This world wasn't on the verge of ending when it ended. It was, by most measures, functioning. And then something arrived that changed the calculation entirely. The pre-Ark technological context matters for understanding how humanity ended up where it is now. The underground infrastructure sustaining human civilization today points towards significant engineering capability in the years before the fall. The bunker cities aren't primitive survival shelters. They're sophisticated urban systems that required enormous planning and resources. That means somebody started building them in advance. Whether that was in response to early Ark warnings or for other reasons is one of the lore's more interesting open questions. But the scale of what was built underground suggests a preparation effort that had been underway for some time before the machines ever arrived. Pre-Ark society appears to have been roughly continuous with contemporary social structures, with the usual technological upgrades. Throughout the game's lore, there are references to governments, corporations, research institutions, and private organizations that all existed before and, in some form, continued after the Ark event. This matters because many of the power structures operating underground aren't new inventions. They're carryovers from the surface world, adapted to new circumstances, but carrying the same institutional DNA. The people in charge underground aren't necessarily the best leaders for a post-Ark world. They're often just whoever managed to hold on to power from before. The game's refusal to give us a precise date for Ark's arrival is itself a storytelling choice worth noting. It keeps the world slightly out of focus in a way that makes it feel plausibly real rather than pinned to a speculative calendar. It also means players can't easily calculate how long humanity has been underground, which preserves a certain ambiguity about how much has been forgotten. One reading of this choice suggests that the loss of reliable timekeeping is part of the story. When you're living in a sealed community underground, the precise count of years starts to lose its meaning in ways that it never does on the surface. Pre-Ark humanity had, based on the available evidence, a relatively robust scientific infrastructure. Research documents and terminal logs scattered across the surface reference multiple active scientific programs, several of which seem relevant to what eventually happened. There are hints of space observation programs, atmospheric monitoring projects, and materials research that all predate the Ark event. Whether any of these programs detected Ark before it arrived is a question the lore keeps deliberately open. Some fragments suggest there were early warnings that weren't taken seriously, or that were classified. Others suggest the arrival was genuinely without warning. The truth probably lives somewhere between those two versions. Pre-Ark military infrastructure runs quietly through the lore. The weapons technology available to raiders has clear lineage from surface-era military development. Some of the most effective tools for dealing with Ark machines appear to have been adapted from pre-existing military hardware. This suggests either that surface militaries were at least partially prepared to fight something like Ark, or that their existing equipment happened to translate effectively to the new threat. If militaries were preparing, there was advanced knowledge. If the translation was incidental, Ark's vulnerabilities are more conventional than its origins might suggest. Either reading has significant implications for how we understand the relationship between pre-Ark institutions and the event that followed. Looking at the surface ruins through an economic lens gives you a picture of a consumer society in full swing. Distribution centres, commercial infrastructure, logistics hubs. A lot of what raiders scavenge today is essentially the leftovers of a functioning supply chain. The surface world was producing and moving enormous quantities of goods. That makes the interruption all the more striking. Ark didn't just end lives, it ended an entire economic system that had been sustaining billions of people. The underground communities are, in many ways, attempting to reconstruct the most basic functions of that system with radically fewer resources and radically more constraints. Among the more haunting surface finds are the cultural artifacts, entertainment media, art objects, personal communications, community notices. People were living culturally rich lives in many areas that are now ruins. The game doesn't dwell on this. It lets the objects speak for themselves. But the cumulative effect is a portrait of a civilization that had a great deal to lose. This wasn't a world that had already given up or become spiritually exhausted. It was engaged, producing, creating. The Ark event didn't just end human habitation of the surface. In a meaningful sense, it ended a particular chapter of human culture, and no one has yet figured out exactly where the next chapter begins. There are enough lore fragments referencing academic and research institutions to suggest that pre-Ark humanity was in the middle of significant scientific investigation across a number of fields: materials science, space observation, atmospheric chemistry, and artificial intelligence. That last one is worth pausing on. Pre-Ark AI development appears to have been at an advanced stage in certain sectors. This connects to later questions about Ark itself in ways the lore is careful not to make explicit, but the parallel is hard to miss once you've spent time with the material. A civilization pushing hard on AI development gets visited by entities of unknown but apparently high intelligence. The connection may be coincidental, it may not be. One theme that runs consistently through pre-Ark lore fragments is a strained relationship between corporate entities and state governments. Several of the factions that now operate underground appear to be descended from corporate structures rather than governmental ones, which suggests that in the final pre-Ark period, certain corporations were accumulating significant independent capability. They weren't just businesses, they were organizations with their own security forces, their own research programs, their own infrastructure plans. When Ark arrived, these organizations had both the motive and the means to survive independently, and that shapes the underground political landscape to this day in ways that are still actively contentious. The lore is somewhat careful about how it portrays the environmental state of the surface before Ark. There are hints that certain environmental stresses were already present: resource depletion, atmospheric changes, ecosystem disruption. Whether Ark's arrival was in any way connected to these pre-existing conditions is a question the game raises without answering. One interpretation is that Ark arrived in response to signals that Earth's environment was reaching certain thresholds. Another is that the environmental damage was unrelated, and Ark was simply bad timing piled on top of existing problems. The ruins don't resolve this. They just sit there, quietly ambiguous, holding whatever answer they contain, without giving it up. The communications technology visible in the ruins tells you a lot about how connected pre-Ark society was. Dense network infrastructure, relay stations, satellite uplink equipment. This was a fully networked world. Information moved quickly and freely. at least in principle. What's interesting about this in retrospect is that Ark appears to have disrupted global communications as one of its early effects. The implication is either that Ark needed to isolate human communities to make them easier to manage, or that Ark's activity simply destroyed communications infrastructure as a side effect. The difference matters enormously. One suggests Ark thought about humans strategically. The other doesn't require that assumption. There's a specific quality to pre-Ark surface locations that suggests the final days before the event were not obviously different from any other period. People weren't panicking. Commerce was continuing. Communities were planning for futures that would never arrive. Some lore fragments point toward a specific incident or observation that preceded Ark's arrival, but it wasn't widely known or widely believed. The population at large appears to have had little to no warning. This is different from the story of, say, a nuclear exchange, where at least some proportion of the population knew what was coming. Ark arrived into a world that wasn't braced for it, and that lack of preparation shaped everything about how humanity managed the transition. It's worth being honest about the limits of what the lore establishes about the pre-Ark world. The surface ruins show us a physical environment, but not a comprehensive historical record. There are significant gaps in what we know about pre-Ark political events, scientific discoveries, and social movements. The underground authorities don't seem particularly motivated to fill in those gaps. If anything, some fragments suggest deliberate historical management of the record. What we're working with is essentially a collection of physical artifacts, personal documents, and institutional records that survived by accident rather than by curation. The picture they give us is partial and probably skewed towards certain types of locations and demographics. Spending time looking at pre-Ark architecture gives a sense of how the surface world organized itself spatially. Dense residential towers adjacent to commercial zones, with industrial areas at the periphery, transportation infrastructure running between all of it. This is recognizable urban planning with some future-era upgrades. What Ark did to this architecture tells us something about the machine's operational priorities. Some buildings are almost intact, others are systematically dismantled. The pattern of destruction isn't random. It follows a logic that players and researchers have been trying to decode, and we'll get into that in detail in the chapters on Ark behavior and machine intelligence. Among the more affecting lore fragments are those relating to pre-Ark education and child welfare. Schools, playgrounds, children's media. A world that was, whatever its problems, raising a next generation and making plans for that generation's future. The children who are alive underground today are the ones who were evacuated before Ark consolidated its hold on the surface. They have memories, or in the case of younger children, second-hand stories of a world their parents and grandparents lost. The psychological weight of that loss shapes the underground communities in ways the lore acknowledges without dwelling on at length. But the weight is always there, underneath every conversation about what comes next. The lore pays particular attention to pre-Ark space activity, and for good reason. Humanity in the pre-Ark era wasn't merely observing space. There were active programs of varying ambition, doing various things beyond Earth's atmosphere. Exactly what those programs were doing, and whether any of them encountered or interacted with Ark before the surface event, is one of the lore's most carefully guarded ambiguities. What's been pieced together from terminal logs and research notes suggests that at least some pre-Ark space activity intersected with observations that would later be recognized as early Ark phenomena. The question is what was done with those observations and why the broader population was never told. Not all pre-Ark technology survived the transition underground. The technologies that made it tend to fall into two categories: those that the underground communities actively needed for survival and invested in preserving, and those that were robust enough to survive neglect and physical damage. What this selection pressure produces is a technological ecosystem underground that's significantly different from what the surface had. Some areas are surprisingly advanced: energy systems, medical technology, manufacturing. Others are surprisingly primitive: consumer goods, communication tools, cultural production technology. The survivors brought what they needed to stay alive. Cultural and recreational technology mostly didn't make the cut, which tells you something about how extreme the conditions were during the transition. One of the most consistently suppressed threads in the pre-Ark lore is the question of whether there was deliberate contact between pre-Ark human organizations and whatever Ark represents. The suppression itself is informative. If there was no contact, there's nothing to suppress. The fragments that survive from the pre-Ark period touching on this question are heavily redacted or physically damaged in ways that could be accidental, but don't always feel that way. Raiders who have come back with unredacted versions of certain documents tend to find those documents confiscated and themselves subjected to questioning. The pattern suggests that somebody knows something and has a strong interest in keeping it contained. This is where the lore gets genuinely murky, and deliberately so. Some fragments suggest that pre-Ark governmental bodies had intelligence about an incoming threat that wasn't shared with the public. The scale and sophistication of the underground infrastructure points toward preparation that would have required years of advance work, which in turn suggests decision-makers knew something was coming well before the general population was aware. Whether those decision-makers acted with the public's interest in mind or their own is a question the underground factions argue about constantly. And it's not an abstract debate. It has direct implications for who has legitimate authority now, and those implications haven't been resolved. Separate from, and sometimes in competition with, governmental underground programs were corporate initiatives with the same basic goal: survival for a select population. Several of the underground communities that now exist as factions trace their origins to corporate continuity programs. These programs were well-funded, technically sophisticated, and conspicuously selective about who they included. Records from this period are fragmentary, but what survives suggests that access to these programs was determined by a combination of specialized skills, personal connections, and, in some cases, financial means. This origin shapes the culture of the resulting communities in ways that are still visible in how they operate today, decades after the initial transition. One aspect of pre-Ark Earth that tends to get overlooked in lore discussions is the non-human world: plants, animals, ecosystems. The surface ruins show a world from which wildlife has not entirely disappeared. There are signs of fauna having moved into abandoned human spaces, as tends to happen when human activity recedes. Ark machines don't appear to be specifically targeting biological life beyond humans, which is interesting in itself. Whether this represents a deliberate operational choice on Ark's part, or simply reflects what Ark is trying to accomplish, is another open question. But the presence of non-human life on a surface that Ark controls tells you something about what Ark's actual objectives are, and what they aren't. Embedded in the surface lore fragments is a strong sense that pre-Ark humanity had a particular orientation toward the future: optimistic in some respects, anxious in others, but fundamentally forward-looking. Plans were being made, investments were happening, people were building things intended to last decades. There is something specifically sorrowful about this orientation in retrospect, knowing what arrived. The future those plans were aimed toward no longer exists. The underground communities live in the wreckage of somebody else's vision for what was supposed to come next, and they're trying to build their own version out of the salvage, without always knowing what the original blueprints were supposed to look like. Between the recognizable pre-Ark world and the established underground civilization, there's a transition period that the lore covers unevenly. Fragments from this period, roughly the first months and years of Ark's presence, are among the most difficult to interpret. This seems partly to reflect the actual chaos of the period, and partly a subsequent management of the record. What comes through clearly is that the transition was brutal and fast. The window for surface evacuation appears to have been shorter than anyone planned for. Communities that expected weeks got days. Decisions that expected months of deliberation had to be made in hours. The scar of that compression is still visible in the underground communities today, in the gaps between what those communities intended to be and what they actually became. Any honest accounting of the pre-Ark world has to grapple with the scale of what was lost. Not just infrastructure and technology, though those losses were enormous. Cultural archives, scientific research in progress, art, personal histories, biological diversity, languages and dialects that had nobody to carry them forward. The underground communities have done their best to preserve what could be preserved, but the fraction saved is small compared to what existed. The raiders who go topside aren't just collecting resources. In some cases, they're finding the last surviving instances of things that no longer exist anywhere else. That makes the act of raiding something more than a job, even when it doesn't feel that way. One of the tensest issues in underground communities is how pre-Ark history is taught and remembered. There are competing interests at work. Official histories tend to emphasize the competence and foresight of the groups that organize the underground communities, minimizing evidence of failures, bad decisions, and deliberate exclusions. Unofficial histories, passed down through personal networks and recovered from surface documents, tend to tell a different story. The raiders are, among their other roles, unofficial historians. The documents they bring back from the surface have a way of complicating the official narrative, which is part of why certain authorities are ambivalent about raiding activity despite depending on it for resources. The past has political weight in the underground, and the raiders carry that weight topside with them every time they go. Not all the technology still sitting on the surface was left there by accident. Some was too large to move, some was considered non-essential, but some fragments suggest that certain technology was deliberately abandoned rather than transported, not because it couldn't be moved, but because whoever made the decision about what came underground decided it shouldn't. The implications vary depending on what was left behind. If it was military hardware, the decision might have been practical or political. If it was research equipment, it might reflect a decision about what fields of study would be pursued underground. If it was communications infrastructure, it might have been a decision about isolation, about who would be able to talk to whom, and who would be cut off. It would be dishonest not to acknowledge the role of luck in determining who survived and who didn't. The pre-Ark world had billions of people. The underground communities have a fraction of that. The selection process was partly deliberate. Governments and corporations chose who to include, but partly arbitrary. Proximity to an entrance, speed of response, being in the right place when the window closed. The underground communities sometimes present their composition as the result of deliberate choices about preserving the best and the brightest. The truth is more complicated and more arbitrary than that story allows, and the communities that are most honest about this fact tend to function better than the ones that maintain the myth of deserved survival. The people who went underground as adults are a distinct cohort. They have direct embodied memories of the surface world. They remember what sunlight feels like, what weather is, what open space means. This memory is simultaneously a resource and a burden. It's a resource because it connects the underground communities to a history and a mode of living that could potentially be recovered. It's a burden because it creates a form of grief that doesn't go away, a constant awareness of what has been lost that can become destabilizing if it intensifies into collective despair. Underground leadership has had to navigate this tension carefully from the very beginning, and it hasn't always gotten the balance right. The first generation of children born entirely underground has now grown up. These individuals have no direct sensory memory of the surface. They know it through stories, recordings, and the second-hand accounts of older community members. Their relationship to the idea of the surface is fundamentally different from those who lived there. For some, the surface is a mythological space, a paradise of open sky and freedom, and for others, It's an abstraction that doesn't feel fully real. The raiders drawn from this generation tend to have a different psychological profile from older raiders. For them, the surface is discovery rather than recovery. That distinction sounds small, but it shapes how they move up there, what they're looking for, and what they bring back. The social structures that emerged underground weren't flat. Resources were scarce and unevenly distributed. Skills were unevenly distributed. Social connections from the pre-Ark world translated into advantages in the new context. The communities that formed quickly developed hierarchies, and those hierarchies solidified over time. People who came underground with power often emerged with more. People who came with nothing often stayed with nothing. The raiders exist in an interesting social position relative to these structures. They're economically valuable, they bring back resources the underground needs, but they operate outside the direct control structures of the communities, which makes some authorities nervous. There are people in positions of power who would prefer the surface to be less accessible than it is. Underground communities aren't entirely isolated from one another. There are communication systems that allow different communities to coordinate on certain issues. But those systems are controlled by specific actors with specific interests, and the flow of information between communities is managed rather than free. What one community knows about another's situation is partly a function of what the controlling parties want them to know. Raiders moving between communities are one of the few sources of information that bypasses these controlled channels, which gives them a social function that goes beyond resource collection. They're also intelligence networks, whether or not they think of themselves that way. That's a role that comes with complications. The early underground period was characterized by intensive effort to understand what Ark was and what it wanted. Surface observation programs were established. Captured Ark machine components were analyzed. Communication attempts were made, though these are rarely discussed openly. The findings from this early period inform the strategies communities use today for managing raiding operations. But the findings also appear to have included information that wasn't widely shared. Certain research from the early underground period is classified or simply unavailable, which creates a persistent suspicion that leadership knows more about Ark than they're saying. That suspicion is, at this point, old enough that it has its own mythology attached to it. The original raiding operations weren't called that. In the early underground period, they were framed as supply runs, salvage operations, or tactical reconnaissance. The evolution of raiding into a recognized profession and social identity happened gradually, as it became clear that surface operations weren't going to stop being necessary. The first people who went topside regularly were mostly military or security personnel on assigned missions. Over time, a separate culture developed around surface operations, with its own norms, its own equipment traditions, and its own relationship to risk. The professionalization of raiding created the raiders we see today, a specific kind of person, shaped by a specific kind of work, who exists in a specific kind of tension with the underground communities that depend on them. Underground engineers working with recovered Ark components developed increasingly effective tools for surface operations over the years. This wasn't a clean linear process. There were setbacks, failed experiments, and approaches that looked promising and turned out to be dead ends. The technology that works today reflects decades of accumulated learning, much of it purchased with the lives of raiders who tested equipment under real conditions. This history gives the technological culture of raiding a specific texture. There's a deep respect for what was learned the hard way, and a healthy skepticism toward untested theories about Ark behavior that haven't been validated in the field. The people who didn't listen to experienced raiders tended not to stay raiders for long. In the underground communities, a rich set of beliefs, stories, and interpretive frameworks has developed around Ark. Some of these are clearly functional. They provide emotional frameworks for dealing with the fear and grief associated with the surface loss. Others are more interesting from a lore perspective because they preserve, in distorted form, observations and fragments of information that point toward real aspects of Ark behaviour. The line between Ark mythology and Ark lore isn't always clear, and serious investigators of the machines have to spend time with both. Sometimes the most accurate piece of information about Ark is embedded in a story that looks on the surface like superstition, which is one of the reasons the investigative process is as complicated as it is. Underground communities have developed strong political positions on the question of the surface. There are factions that believe the surface can be reclaimed, and that doing so should be the central goal. There are factions that believe the surface is permanently lost and that energy should go into making underground life as sustainable and complete as possible. There are factions that are agnostic on the long-term question, but focused on immediate operational needs. These political differences shape the resource allocation decisions that affect raiders directly. They create ideological tensions that play out in the daily life of the communities, sometimes quietly and sometimes very loudly. The surface isn't just a physical location, it's a political idea. When underground residents talk about the pre-Ark world, when they allow themselves to, the emotional register is complex. There is grief, but there's also something that functions like nostalgia for a world that had its own serious problems. The pre-Ark world wasn't uniformly good. It had poverty and violence and environmental damage and political dysfunction. But it had sky. It had the possibility of unlimited movement. It had a scale and an openness that the underground simply cannot replicate. The loss of those specific qualities, openness, scale, sky, is what people seem to mourn most consistently. You don't miss the commute. You miss the possibility of going somewhere you've never been without planning permission and an armed escort. Something that runs through underground culture consistently is what might be called the archive imperative, the felt obligation to document, preserve, and transmit pre-Ark knowledge and culture to future generations. Libraries, recordings, and oral history programs exist in most communities. Raiders are often informally asked to bring back anything that looks archivally significant. The emotional weight behind this imperative is clear. If the surface can eventually be reclaimed, the people who reclaim it should be able to find the history of what was there before. The archive is a form of hope, a bet that the story isn't finished and that the record will eventually matter to somebody who can use it to build something better than what was lost. Some underground thinkers treat the pre-Ark world primarily as a cautionary tale, a civilization that made specific mistakes that contributed to its own destruction, from which lessons should be drawn. Others resist this framing, arguing that it implies the pre-Ark world brought Ark on itself, which is both factually unverified and psychologically damaging. The debate reflects deeper disagreements about agency and historical causation that haven't been resolved. What's interesting from a lore perspective is that the cautionary tale interpretation requires a belief that Ark's arrival was somehow triggered by human activity, which is a much more specific and loaded claim than it might initially appear, and one that underground authorities seem particularly motivated to either confirm or deny, depending on which answer suits their interests. The surface that raiders move through today is not the same surface that existed in the transition period. Decades of Ark activity have physically transformed parts of it in ways that weren't predicted. Some areas have been dismantled or rearranged. Some show evidence of Ark construction activity. Some areas that were heavily contested in the transition period are now eerily quiet, suggesting that whatever Ark was doing there, it finished. The trajectory of the surface transformation from human-made environment to Ark-modified environment is ongoing, and raiders who run the same routes repeatedly report changes that are consistent and directional rather than random. Something is being built, or changed, or completed. The question is what? The fundamental question that the pre-Ark world's history sets up is whether and when humanity can return to the surface. This isn't just a practical question about defeating Ark, though that's part of it. It's also a question about what kind of world would be reclaimed. The surface today is not the pre-Ark world. It's been changed. Whatever Ark has been doing up there for decades has left marks that can't simply be ignored. The communities that might return would be returning to a surface they don't fully know, shaped by an entity they don't fully understand, for purposes that haven't been clearly established. Return, if it comes, will be to something new as much as to something recovered, and that distinction will matter enormously when the time comes. Any account of the pre-Ark world eventually arrives at this question. What did pre-Ark Earth represent to Ark? Was it simply a material environment to be managed, a source of specific resources, a population to be studied, a problem to be solved? The fragments that survive don't give us a clear answer, but they're suggestive. Ark's behaviour toward the surface world doesn't look like random destruction. It looks like purposeful modification. What the purpose is, we don't fully know. But the fact that Ark arrived in the context of a specific kind of civilization, industrialized, networked, technologically capable, and not before, is a data point that serious investigators of Ark consistently return to. The timing wasn't accidental. Nothing about Ark looks accidental. The pre-Ark world, then, is the context that makes everything else in Ark Raiders lore meaningful. It's the baseline from which humanity fell, the measure of what was lost, and the origin of the political and cultural structures that shape the underground communities today. It's also, possibly, the source of the conditions that brought Ark to Earth in the first place. Before we can understand what Ark is, we need to understand what it arrived into. And now that we have that context, we can start looking at the first fall itself, when the machines came, what that looks like on the ground, and what the behaviour of those first units tells us about what Ark was designed or driven to do. Chapter 2. The First Fall, when Ark came down. Nobody who was alive when Ark first came down describes it as an obvious ending. The early accounts recovered from surface locations and underground archives alike describe something stranger than sudden catastrophe. Ark's arrival was a process, not a single event. The machines didn't appear all at once in a coordinated planetary assault. They came down in what early observers described as a steady fall, a continuous stream from somewhere above the atmosphere, arriving over weeks and months rather than hours. This gradual quality confused the response. It wasn't clearly a crisis at first. It looked, to some observers, like it might be something else entirely, an unusual natural phenomenon, a classified military test, something with an explanation just around the corner. The first recorded observations of Ark falling aren't from military or governmental sources. They're from civilian observers who noticed something unusual in the sky and documented it through the communication channels available to them. These early accounts are fragmentary but consistent in certain details. The incoming objects were large enough to be visible. They were not moving on trajectories consistent with natural meteoric phenomena. They were slowing down on approach in ways that natural objects don't. The early observers didn't have a framework for what they were seeing, which is why the early descriptions are more evocative than analytical. Something was coming down from above. It wasn't natural, and it was coming with apparent intention. The official response to Ark's arrival followed a timeline that looks, in retrospect, dangerously slow. Initial observations were classified before they could circulate widely. Official public communications characterized early Ark activity as something other than what it actually was. By the time governmental bodies acknowledged the reality of the situation, the window for comprehensive public preparation had significantly narrowed. This timeline is one of the most contested aspects of the Ark event in underground historical discourse. Some accounts suggest the delay was deliberate, that authorities needed time to prepare their own communities before the public understood the scale of the threat. Others argue the delay reflected genuine institutional confusion. The available evidence points in both directions simultaneously. The geographic distribution of initial Ark landings is a subject of ongoing analysis among underground researchers. The first machines didn't land uniformly. They concentrated in specific regions and then spread from those initial landing zones. The selection criteria for initial landing zones aren't entirely clear. Some researchers argue they correlate with population density, suggesting Ark was targeting the largest concentrations of human activity first. Others argue they correlate with certain geological or environmental features, suggesting Ark's landing selection was driven by something other than the human geography. The truth may be a combination. Ark may have been tracking multiple variables simultaneously, which would imply a level of operational planning that predates the landing itself by a significant margin. What did the first Ark machines actually do when they arrived? The earliest accounts describe behaviour that was, in some respects, not immediately violent. The first units weren't attacking human populations indiscriminately in the initial moments. They were observed moving with apparent purpose, scanning their environments and interacting with the physical landscape in ways that looked more investigatory than destructive. Violence came, but in many cases it came after this initial investigatory phase rather than coinciding with it. This detail is often overlooked in accounts that emphasize Ark's role as a destructive force. The machines looked first, then they acted. That sequence suggests they were assessing something before beginning operations in earnest, and that assessment had specific parameters. The first human casualties from Ark were not from large-scale assaults. They were from what appears to have been incidental contact. Individuals who encountered Ark units during that early investigatory phase and were treated as a specific category of thing. The accounts don't agree on whether the first casualties were targeted or inadvertent. Some suggest the machines didn't initially treat humans as the primary focus of their attention. Others describe early units specifically targeting humans who approached or interfered with their activity. What's consistent across these accounts is that Ark's response to humans was disproportionate to the threat humans posed. The machines weren't fighting back against an attack. They were applying force to something they had categorized in a specific way, and that categorization didn't include treating humans as actors to be negotiated with. When governmental and military bodies moved from observation to active response, the initial engagements were, by almost any account, badly managed. Pre-Ark militaries had conventional weapons designed for conventional threats. Some of those weapons were effective against certain Ark unit types, others weren't. The learning curve was steep, and it was paid for in casualties. One of the more painful threads in early military response accounts is the gap between the confidence with which commanders approached the initial engagements and the outcomes those engagements produced. Ark didn't behave like a military opponent. It didn't respond to the tactical frameworks that military doctrine had been built around. The early defeats were shocking in their thoroughness, and the shock shaped every strategic decision that followed. Parallel to and apparently unaffected by the early military response, Ark machines were conducting other activities on the surface. While human military forces were engaging specific Ark units, other Ark units in the same general areas were carrying on with tasks that weren't directly related to the fighting. They were collecting things, modifying infrastructure, moving materials. The fighting appeared to be, from Ark's perspective, a management task being handled by dedicated units, while the main operational program continued. Ark wasn't stopping to fight humanity. It was assigning resources to deal with human resistance, while the larger operation proceeded on schedule. The humans were a complication to be managed, not the primary focus of attention. That distinction, once grasped, was deeply unsettling. Estimates of how many Ark units were involved in the first fall period vary, but all of them are large. What's significant isn't just the raw number of machines, but the sustained rate of arrival. Ark units continued to come down throughout the first fall period, which meant that military progress against existing units was continuously offset by new arrivals. The math of this was grasped fairly quickly by analysts working the problem, and their conclusion appears to have accelerated the transition to underground preparation. You can't win a war of attrition against an opponent with an effectively unlimited resupply capacity, and Ark's fall rate showed no signs of decreasing. The strategic calculation had to change, and it had to change fast. In the middle of the chaos of the first fall period, researchers were already trying to classify what they were seeing. Different Ark unit types behaved in distinguishably different ways. Some were clearly combat-oriented, some were clearly oriented toward collection or construction. Some appeared to be serving coordination or communication functions. This early taxonomy wasn't published. It was classified, but elements of it were carried underground and form the basis of the classification systems Raiders use today. The fact that such a taxonomy was possible at all is informative. Ark units aren't undifferentiated. They have types, they have roles, something designed them for specific purposes, and those purposes are coherent enough to be categorized using criteria that make internal sense. One of the consistent features of early Ark activity is the specific relationship to human infrastructure. The machines weren't destroying infrastructure randomly. They were interacting with it selectively. Some infrastructure was left completely alone. Some was destroyed quickly. Some was modified. Some was apparently repurposed. The pattern that emerges from careful analysis of first full surface records suggests that Ark had specific information about what human infrastructure was and what it could be used for. A machine that just arrived from space with no prior knowledge of human civilization doesn't interact with infrastructure selectively. Ark's selective interaction suggests it knew what it was looking at, that it had done the equivalent of homework before it arrived. During the first full period, there were multiple attempts to communicate with Ark units. These attempts ranged from military radio transmissions to academic efforts to identify and transmit patterns that might be recognized as intentional communication. The outcomes of these attempts are poorly documented in available records. What's been pieced together suggests that some communication attempts produced observable responses, not conversational engagement, but changes in Ark behavior consistent with having received and processed the communication. Whether those responses were acknowledgement, dismissal, or something else entirely isn't clear, but the pattern suggests that Ark was not simply ignoring human communication attempts. Something was registering them, and whatever registered them decided, apparently, that they didn't warrant a direct response. The timeline from initial Ark arrival to effective human loss of the surface was faster than most models had predicted. Regions that were assessed as safe or defensible turned out not to be. The speed of Ark's operational expansion across the surface outpaced human ability to establish defensive perimeters. This pace of loss forced constant recalculation of the underground preparation timeline. Communities that had planned for years of gradual transition had weeks or months. Some communities that had barely begun preparation had days. The compression of the timeline is one of the primary explanations for why the underground communities are as incomplete as they are. The full preparation that was theoretically possible never happened, and the gaps left by that incompleteness are still being dealt with today. Ark's behavior around major human population centers during the first full period is a subject of particular analytical interest. The machines moved into cities in ways that weren't simply destructive. They were organized. Different unit types moved into different urban zones. The pattern of their movement through cities suggests a prepared operational plan, as though they had studied the cities before arriving and knew what they would find where. The specificity of this behavior is one of the stronger pieces of circumstantial evidence that Ark had access to information about Earth's human geography before the first fall began. They arrived knowing where things were. That's not a feature of a random encounter. That's a feature of a mission. For the populations experiencing the first fall, the psychological impact was shattering in ways that went beyond the physical danger. Part of this was the unfamiliarity of the threat. Human psychology has evolved to handle various categories of danger, and human civilization had developed frameworks for processing various types of catastrophe. But Ark wasn't in any of those categories. It wasn't a natural disaster, a disease, a war with another human faction, or any other catastrophic scenario that existing frameworks were built to process. It was something from outside the entire framework, a genuinely novel form of threat, and the psychological vertigo of that novelty compounded the physical terror of the machines themselves in ways that made organised response far harder than it should have been. Accounts of the first fall period consistently include observations about how the machines responded to children. There are accounts of Ark units that, when encountering children during the investigatory phase, behaved differently than they did with adults. The nature of this difference varies across accounts and is difficult to interpret. Some describe what might be characterized as reduced aggression. Others describe something else entirely, a different quality of attention rather than reduced hostility. There are also accounts of children being in proximity to Ark units that were actively engaged elsewhere and simply being ignored. The inconsistency in Ark's behaviour toward children is another of the first fall's unsolved puzzles, and it's one that tends to make people uncomfortable when they look at it too closely. The underground preparation happening during the first fall was a massive, partly visible, partly secret undertaking. Populations were being moved, resources were being cached, infrastructure was being extended and fortified. All of this was happening against a background of ongoing Ark activity on the surface and an increasing pace of casualties. The people doing this work, engineers, logistics coordinators, security personnel, were operating under extraordinary stress. Some of what they built was robust and has lasted decades. Some of what they built was hasty and has caused problems ever since. The underground world that exists today is a direct product of decisions made under pressure during this period, and the fingerprints of that pressure are visible in the places where the infrastructure doesn't quite fit together. Early observers of Ark noted something interesting about the machine's activity patterns. Ark units were active at all hours, but their behaviour pattern wasn't uniform across the day-night cycle. There were observable differences in the intensity and character of their activity at different times. This isn't consistent with machines that have no internal clock or environmental awareness. The existence of an activity cycle implies that Ark units are responding to environmental variables, light levels, temperature, possibly electromagnetic conditions, in ways that shape their operational pattern. Whether this represents a design feature or an emergent behavioural adaptation is an open question, but it's one that Raiders have learned to exploit operationally, timing surface runs around the patterns that were first observed during the fall. Among the most puzzling behaviours of first fall Ark units was the collection activity. The machines were gathering things. The selection criteria for what they collected weren't initially obvious, but analysis over time has identified patterns. Ark appears to have been particularly interested in certain material types, not necessarily the most economically valuable by pre-Ark human standards, but materials with specific physical or chemical properties. It was also interested in information storage media, anything that contained encoded data, and it appeared to be interested in certain biological materials. The collection behaviour started in the first fall and has continued in various forms ever since. Understanding what Ark is collecting and why is one of the central questions of Ark research, and it's a question nobody has fully answered. As the first fall progressed, observers began identifying areas where Ark activity was consistently absent or minimal. These proto-safe zones were critical for organising underground access points. The factors that determined Ark-free zones weren't always obvious. Geographic isolation accounted for some of them, but others seemed to reflect Ark operational choices, areas that Ark had assessed and decided not to actively monitor or patrol. The existence of these Ark-free zones suggests that Ark was making resource allocation decisions about where to concentrate its activity, which implies a prioritization system of some kind. Ark wasn't just flooding the surface with machines, it was deploying them with intention, and the zones it left quiet were quiet for a reason. One of the early observations that became significant over time was Ark's apparent sensitivity to atmospheric conditions. Some first-fall behaviors correlated with atmospheric events, storms, temperature inversions, pressure changes, in ways that suggested the machines were either responding to or actively manipulating atmospheric conditions. The long-term implications of this observation are still being worked out. What's clear is that Ark's presence has, over the decades since the first fall, produced measurable changes in the surface atmosphere in certain regions. Whether those changes are byproducts of Ark activity or deliberate modifications is one of the more consequential, open questions about what Ark is ultimately trying to do up there, and what the surface will look like when it's done. Accounts from the first fall period include consistent descriptions of the sounds that Ark units make. The acoustic signature of Ark was one of the first things that underground communities tried to use as a warning and identification system. The sounds aren't random. Different unit types produce different characteristic sounds, and those sounds appear to correlate with different operational states: active collection, combat mode, patrol, and others. The development of acoustic-based Ark detection systems built on this early observation is one of the more practical examples of how investigative knowledge about Ark has translated into operational tools. Knowing what Ark sounds like before you can see it has saved lives. It was some of the earliest and most practically important science done in the post-fall period. The first fall didn't just change the physical landscape of Earth, it also changed the political landscape of the underground. Pre-Ark power structures were scrambled by the speed and completeness of the surface loss. Governments that existed before Ark largely ceased to function in their original forms as their territories and populations were taken. What replaced them in the underground communities were structures that often reflected which organizations had been best positioned to manage the transition. In some cases that meant military bodies, in others corporate entities, in others ad hoc communities organized around specific skills or locations. The political diversity of the underground world today is a direct inheritance from the chaotic political reconfiguration of the first fall period, and it's a diversity that creates as many problems as it does strengths. One detail about Ark's first fall behavior that has been extensively analysed is the relationship between Ark units and pre-existing human infrastructure. Some infrastructure was immediately destroyed, some was left intact, some was in ways that took time to recognise being used. Power grids in certain areas continued to function after Ark moved in, not because humans maintained them, but because something else did. Transportation infrastructure in some zones was modified rather than destroyed, with the modifications making sense only if Ark intended to use the infrastructure for its own movement. This utilisation of pre-Ark human infrastructure suggests that Ark either had advanced knowledge of that infrastructure or assessed and adapted to it extremely quickly after arriving. The first fall was, among other things, the moment when the concept of home changed fundamentally for millions of people. Home had been a physical place on the surface, a city, a building, a landscape. That meaning was taken by Ark. What replaced it in the underground communities is something different, more relational, less geographic. Home became community, became faction, became the specific corridor or district of the underground where you lived and worked. The emotional weight of this transformation, the grief of losing the geographic meaning of home and having to construct a new meaning under pressure, runs through underground culture like a fault line. It's not always visible on the surface of daily life, but it's always there, and when conditions change, it moves. Almost immediately, after the first fall began, organised research efforts to understand Ark were initiated. These programs were, by necessity, hazardous. Getting close enough to Ark units to study them without being killed required either remote observation, which was limited in what it could tell you, or close-range work with the help of people willing to take significant personal risks. The earliest Ark researchers operated under conditions of extreme uncertainty, often without protective equipment specifically designed for the purpose, using whatever instruments could be adapted from pre-Ark scientific tools. What they found in those early studies still informs Ark research today, though the findings were uneven and sometimes contradicted each other in ways that took years to resolve, and some contradictions that were never fully resolved at all. Early in the first fall period, military analysts began asking whether Ark had a command structure, a hierarchy of authority that governed how different units related to each other and who, if anyone, was issuing the operational directives. This question was important for obvious military reasons. If there was a command hierarchy, disrupting it might degrade all Ark's operational effectiveness. If there wasn't, the distributed nature of Ark activity would require a different strategic response. The evidence gathered in the first fall period was ambiguous on this point. Ark units behaved in ways that were clearly coordinated, but the coordination didn't appear to flow from a single, identifiable command source. The coordination was more like consensus. Something was aligning their behavior from within, rather than directing it from above. An unexpected observation from the first fall period was Ark's apparent response to human cultural artifacts. Certain materials, visual art, recorded music, written text, seemed to produce behaviors in Ark units that were different from their response to other objects of similar physical dimensions and material composition. Some researchers interpreted this as Ark's sensors failing to correctly categorize cultural objects. Others interpreted it as something more significant, an indication that Ark units were recognizing cultural artifacts as a distinct category of object, rather than failing to categorize them at all. The distinction matters. One explanation requires only sensors. The other requires something more like recognition. The first fall data doesn't resolve the question, but it raises it in a way that subsequent investigation has never fully put to rest. One of the defining features of the first fall that distinguishes Ark from other catastrophic scenarios is that it didn't stop. The first fall wasn't an event that ended and left a static situation to deal with. Ark units continued to arrive. The machines continued to fall from whatever source above the atmosphere was sending them. This ongoing nature of the Ark arrival is a fundamental feature of the strategic situation that underground communities face. It's not a matter of defeating the machines already present. New machines arrive continuously. The underground is not managing a fixed enemy. It's managing a dynamic, continuously reinforced one. That distinction changes everything about what a viable solution might eventually look like. Taking the first fall as a whole, the geographic distribution of initial landings, the operational specialization of unit types, the targeting of specific infrastructure categories, the behavioral patterns suggesting prior knowledge, the evidence points toward a significant amount of advanced planning. The first fall doesn't look like an improvised operation. It looks like the execution of a prepared plan that required substantial prior intelligence about Earth's geography, infrastructure, and population distribution. A plan that had a clear operational logic, even when the ultimate objective of that logic wasn't clear. Something, somewhere, had been planning this for a considerable time before it happened. The question of where that planning happened is one we'll return to. Some of the people who were adults during the first fall are still alive in the underground communities today. They're elderly, but they exist, and they carry a form of direct witness that cannot be preserved in any document. Talking to first fall survivors, which raiders occasionally do when they encounter them in communities, produces a qualitatively different kind of knowledge than reading archival records. The emotional register, the specific sensory details, the moments that stuck in individual memory and the moments that didn't, These can't be captured in official histories. The Raiders, who have had extended conversations with firstfall survivors, sometimes carry information about the transition period that isn't available anywhere else, and that information tends to complicate clean narratives about what happened and why. Returning to the question of dating the first fall, the game is deliberately vague about the year, but there are clues that allow rough triangulation. Technological artifacts visible in the ruins point toward a near-future context. The age ranges of characters who remember the surface point toward a transition not more than several decades ago. Some specific technological references in terminal logs can be used to bracket the possible date range. None of this produces a precise date, but it does suggest a window. For this video's purposes, what matters isn't the exact year, but the relative timeline. How long ago the fall was, how long the underground communities have been established, and what has changed in the intervening period between the fall and the present of the game. What the machines did with what they collected in the first fall remains one of the lore's persistent puzzles. Some collected materials appear to have been transported to specific locations and cached there. Some appear to have been processed, broken down into component materials used in ways that aren't fully understood. Some may have been transmitted off-planet, a hypothesis that requires a form of Ark infrastructure the underground communities have never directly confirmed but have inferred from certain surface observations. What is clear is that the collection was purposeful. Ark wasn't hoarding randomly, it was collecting according to criteria that served an objective, and that objective is one of the most important things to understand about what Ark is actually doing on Earth. The first fall set in motion a set of long-term psychological changes in human communities that are still playing out. The relationship to external threat has been permanently altered. The Ark event demonstrated that threat can come from outside any previously imagined framework of danger. The relationship to open sky has been profoundly affected. Ark literally fell from the sky, which gives that particular environment a threat valence it never had before. And the relationship to technological systems has been complicated. Ark is itself a highly technological entity, which creates ambivalence about technology as both the source of the threat and one of the primary tools for managing it. These psychological changes are structural, not individual. They run through the culture, not just the people. One of the more striking aspects of the first fall is what Ark did not do. Ark's activity focused on the surface. The machines did not, in the first fall period, attempt to access or destroy underground infrastructure in any systematic way. This restraint, if that's what it was, is significant. The underground communities were not secret, their existence was known, and their physical locations were, to any entity with sufficient intelligence about pre-Ark Earth, inferable. Ark could have targeted underground access points more aggressively than it did. The fact that it didn't raises a question that researchers have been sitting with ever since. Did Ark not know about the underground communities, not care about them, or have specific reasons to leave them intact? Early research on Ark units from the first fall period included attempts to understand the machine's response to biological systems. The results were consistent in some respects and puzzling in others. Ark units responded to human activity consistently and with organized force. Ark units responded to non-human biological life inconsistently. Animals encountered by Ark units during the first fall were treated differently than humans, sometimes ignored, sometimes avoided, sometimes collected. The collection of non-human biological material by Ark units is one of the less discussed aspects of first fall behavior, and it connects to broader questions about what Ark is actually trying to accomplish on the surface, and why humans specifically warrant the level of response they get. The very first surface operations conducted after underground communities established themselves weren't framed as raiding. They were framed as resistance, reclamation, or reconnaissance. But the operational reality was immediately the same as what raiders do today. Small groups went topside, moved through Ark-occupied territory, collected what was needed, and came back. The skills required were different from military combat skills. Though overlap existed, the people who were good at it tended to combine physical capability, situational awareness, tolerance for ambiguity, and a specific relationship to fear that allowed them to function effectively under extreme stress without suppressing the information fear provides. Those qualities haven't changed. The raiders who thrive today have the same profile as the first ones who went up. In the aftermath of the first fall, researchers cataloguing the state of the surface noticed something unexpected. Ark had not destroyed everything. Far from it. Large portions of the surface world's physical infrastructure remained intact. Some was clearly because Ark had repurposed it for its own use, but some appeared simply not to have been touched. The pattern of what was destroyed versus what was spared doesn't map cleanly onto any single obvious explanation. Ark destroyed some things that seemed logistically inconsequential. Ark spared some things that seemed strategically significant. The destruction pattern, like everything else about the first fall, was driven by operational needs that are still only partially understood. The first weeks after it became clear that the surface was lost were characterized by a peculiar combination of frantic activity and numbing grief. The underground communities were still settling in, still figuring out basic functionality. Chapter 4. The Signal Before the Fall. What pre-Ark humanity knew the suppression of pre-Ark contact research is, by itself, one of the most informative things about what that research found. You don't suppress findings that are reassuring. You don't classify data that leads nowhere. The consistent pattern of redaction, confiscation, and institutional amnesia around a specific category of pre-Ark scientific work tells you, before you've read a single document, that what was found in that category was significant enough to threaten something. The question is what it threatened, and for whom. To understand the suppression, you have to understand the shape of the research that preceded it. Pre-Ark humanity had, in the years and decades before the first fall, a reasonably mature infrastructure for observing and studying phenomena outside Earth's atmosphere. The surface ruins preserve fragments of this infrastructure: antenna arrays, signal processing facilities, atmospheric monitoring stations, and what appear to be dedicated observational outposts positioned to detect specific types of incoming signals, rather than the general-purpose astronomical observation most people would recognize. Some of these facilities were public knowledge, others clearly weren't. The existence of dedicated signal detection infrastructure that doesn't appear in any public record of pre-Ark scientific programs is one of the first data points serious researchers hit when they start pulling on this thread. The signals themselves are what the available fragments describe, imperfectly and partially. Something was being received. The chronology of discovery, as best as it can be reconstructed from surviving logs and recovered documents, suggests that the earliest detected signals predate the first fall by years, possibly by decades. The signals weren't immediately recognized for what they were. The early detection logs describe anomalous readings that didn't fit expected natural source profiles, which prompted investigation rather than alarm. The investigation found a signal that was structured, not in any way that the analysts of the time could immediately interpret, but structured in the sense that distinguishes intentional communication from noise. The structure implied a source. The source implied to anyone willing to follow the implication honestly, intention. The decision to classify this finding rather than publish it is the pivot point that everything else turns on. Underground historians who have pieced together this part of the timeline argue about why the classification happened, whether it was fear, institutional caution, political calculation, or something more specific to the content of the signal itself. The answer probably includes all of those elements in proportions that varied by institution and by the specific individuals who made the decisions. What the consequences of the decision look like from the current vantage point is this: a finding that might have produced broad public awareness and collective preparation instead produced a secret that a small number of people carried into the underground, and which has been managed by their institutional successors ever since. Some fragments from this early detection period have survived in forms that allow partial analysis. What they describe is a signal source that wasn't stationary. The detected origin point moved, slowly but measurably, on a trajectory that, if projected forward from the observation dates, would bring whatever was broadcasting it toward Earth's vicinity within a time frame that corresponds, roughly, to the first full window. The analysts who made this observation knew what they were looking at. The trajectory calculation wasn't ambiguous. Something was coming, and it was broadcasting as it came, and whoever was tracking it knew approximately when it would arrive. That knowledge was not shared. The content of the signal is where the available fragments become genuinely difficult to interpret, and where the suppression is most intense. The structural complexity of the detected signal exceeded what contemporary analysis tools could fully process. The early attempts at interpretation produced results that the analysts themselves described, in private logs that survived by accident, as deeply disorienting. Not because the content was clear and alarming, because it was clear and familiar. The specific character of this familiarity is something that surviving fragments gesture at without fully articulating. There are references to patterns that corresponded to known structures, to signal components that appeared to reference things that could only have come from prior knowledge of Earth's electromagnetic environment, to elements that analysts described as looking less like a message from outside and more like a message that already knew its destination. This specific quality, the signal appearing to have been constructed with prior knowledge of Earth, is the detail that underground researchers circle back to most often. It's also the detail that's most heavily suppressed in the records that do survive. There are documents where this observation appears early in a transcript and then is simply absent from the next entry, as though whoever was editing the record recognized that this particular line of observation led somewhere they didn't want documented. The gaps are louder than the text around them. The organizational structure of the pre-Ark detection programs tells you something about how the early signal findings were managed once the significance became clear. Multiple programs operating under different institutional umbrellas, governmental, military, and what appear to have been well-funded private research initiatives, were studying the same phenomenon without, apparently, sharing all of their findings with each other. The information was compartmentalized in a way that meant no single organization had the complete picture. Whether this was deliberate, a way of managing the political risk of a complete picture, or the natural result of competing institutional interests, isn't certain. But the effect was the same. The people who needed to make consequential decisions about what was coming were working with partial information, and the people who held the missing pieces had specific reasons for keeping them. The response programs that developed once the signal's implications were grasped, once at least some decision makers understood that the incoming object was not natural and was approaching with what appeared to be intention, fall into at least two categories that can be distinguished in the surviving record. One category is preparation, the underground infrastructure programs, the resource caching, the development of systems for sustaining human communities below the surface. This category left significant physical evidence because you can't build city-scale underground infrastructure and leave no trace. The second category is something else, a set of programs directed not at surviving the arrival, but at responding to it, at communication, at engagement, at the possibility that whatever was coming could be dealt with before it arrived or engaged with after it did. This second category is the one that's almost entirely absent from accessible records. The absence of the engagement program records is itself a data point. The preparation programs left evidence because they built things. The engagement programs left almost nothing, which suggests either that they produced nothing that could leave physical traces, or that whoever managed the record afterward had stronger motivation to erase the engagement program's history than the preparation programs. The second explanation requires that the engagement program found something, and that what it found was something somebody has very strong ongoing reasons to keep hidden. The pattern of erasure around this specific question, did pre-Ark humanity communicate with Ark before the first fall, is consistent enough and thorough enough to suggest the second explanation is the right one. What the engagement programs might have found, if they found anything, has to be inferred rather than read. The inference works backward from Ark's behaviour during the first fall. An entity arriving with prior knowledge of Earth's geography and infrastructure could have acquired that knowledge through long-range observation, which is technically possible given sufficient time and capability. Or it could have acquired it through information exchange with sources on Earth. Ark's apparent foreknowledge of Earth's systems doesn't require contact, but it's more simply explained by contact than by any alternative. And if there was contact before the first fall, then the history of Ark's relationship to humanity is not simply the history of an invasion, it's the history of something more complicated, an engagement that predates the fall, that some people on Earth were aware of, and that has been structurally hidden from the underground communities ever since. Certain lore fragments from the early underground period, documents that appear to predate the full establishment of the current classification system, contain references to what researchers have come to call the correspondence. The term appears in multiple documents without being defined, which suggests it was a term in established use among a community of researchers who shared a common understanding of what it referred to. What can be inferred from context is that the correspondence was a body of pre-Ark interaction with Ark, communication of some kind, possibly bidirectional, that took place before the first fall. The fragments that reference it treat it as established knowledge rather than hypothesis. They argue about its interpretation, not about whether it existed. The interpretation argument is itself informative. The correspondence, based on how researchers describe disagreeing about it, appears to have been genuinely ambiguous in its content. There were researchers who read it as evidence that Ark's arrival was in some sense invited, that the signal responses sent by pre-Ark engagement programs constituted a form of invitation or acknowledgement that Ark treated as operational authorization. There were researchers who rejected this reading, arguing that Ark's arrival was unilateral and that any apparent responsiveness to pre-Ark signals reflected Ark's information gathering rather than any genuine negotiation. The debate was apparently still unresolved when the classification machinery came down on both sides of it. Whether Ark's arrival was in any meaningful sense provoked by pre-Ark human activity is one of the most politically charged questions in underground intellectual life, precisely because it's a question about culpability. If pre-Ark engagement programs sent signals that functioned in Ark's operational framework as an invitation, then the people who ran those programs and the institutions that gave them authority bear a specific kind of responsibility for what followed, and the successors of those institutions are running significant portions of the underground communities today. The motivation to suppress the correspondence evidence isn't merely embarrassment or institutional self-protection. It's the management of a legitimacy question that, if fully aired, could destabilize the entire political architecture of the underground. People in power today benefit from a version of history in which Ark's arrival was pure external catastrophe. They have an active interest in preventing a version of history from circulating in which it was, at least in part, something that pre-Ark human institutions did to themselves. The faction politics of the underground take on a different quality when read through this lens. The authorities who restrict raider activity, who confiscate surface documents, who maintain classification systems for information that isn't obviously militarily sensitive, their behaviour makes more sense as the management of a historical secret than as simple, authoritarian control. They're not merely protecting power, they're protecting a specific account of the past that their power depends on. And the raiders who go topside and come back with documents are, whether they know it or not, the primary mechanism by which that account is threatened. This is the context in which Ark Raiders lore keeps placing evidence of pre-Ark contact research near evidence of current authority interest in suppression. It's not coincidence. The design is intentional. The surface documents that attract the most aggressive confiscation responses from underground authorities are the ones that sit closest to this thread. The signal detection records, the engagement program fragments, the correspondence references. The raiders who push into this material aren't just finding lore, they're pulling on a thread that, if pulled far enough, would change the fundamental story that the underground communities tell about what happened to them and why. Chapter 5. The Machine. Mind. What Ark wants. This is the chapter that most lore analysis avoids, because the evidence here is less certain and the conclusions are harder to sit with. The question of what Ark wants, whether that framing even applies to a machine system, and if it does, what the answer looks like, is where the lore's most provocative and most carefully guarded implications live. Start with what can be established from behavioural evidence. Ark has been on Earth's surface for decades. In that time, it has demonstrated consistent operational priorities that have not significantly changed. It collects specific materials, it modifies specific systems, it guards specific locations, it continues to fall. New units still arrive, which means whatever is sending them continues to send them, which means the operational directive that drove the first fall is still active. Ark is not winding down. It is not completing a task and withdrawing. It is doing something that takes as long as it takes, and it has been taking a very long time. The consistency of Ark's operational priorities over decades is one of the most significant pieces of evidence about what Ark wants. A system executing a fixed program would be consistent but wouldn't adapt. A system with dynamic goals would adapt but would show drift in its operational priorities as conditions changed. Ark shows both consistency and adaptation simultaneously. The underlying priorities don't change, but the methods and the responses to human activity do. This combination implies something more like a persistent goal structure being pursued by flexible means. There is an objective. The objective doesn't change. The path to the objective adjusts in response to conditions. This is the operational profile of a system with something that, at minimum, functions like intention. What the objective is has to be inferred from what Ark collects, what it modifies, and what it builds. The collection priorities, as established by decades of Ark research, center on specific material categories and on information. The material categories include specific metals and composites with particular electromagnetic properties, biological materials from a range of species, and processed human materials, technology, cultural artifacts, and in some cases that researchers describe with deliberate clinical detachment, biological samples from humans. The information collection is consistent with an entity building a comprehensive model of Earth systems: geological, biological, atmospheric, technological, and cultural. Ark appears to be documenting Earth in extraordinary detail. The question is why? One interpretation is purely extractive. Ark is harvesting resources from Earth for purposes that have nothing to do with Earth itself, raw materials and information that serve an operation whose centre of gravity is elsewhere. Under this interpretation, Earth is a site to be exploited. The surface transformation is systematic resource extraction, and the humans underground are an obstacle to be managed rather than an interest to be addressed. This interpretation is consistent with Ark's behaviour in certain respects, but it struggles to explain the specificity of Ark's information collection. An entity that only wants raw materials doesn't need a comprehensive cultural and biological archive. The information collection implies Ark wants to understand Earth, not just use it. A second interpretation frames Ark's activity as transformative in a more profound sense. Ark isn't extracting from Earth, it's changing Earth. The surface modifications, the atmospheric effects, the construction activity in Ark's significant locations, these aren't signs of extraction, they're signs of engineering. Something is being built on the surface, or the surface itself is being built into something. The collected materials aren't being removed from Earth. They're being used on Earth as components in a project that uses the entire surface as its work site. Under this interpretation, the humans underground aren't an obstacle to Ark's resource extraction. They're inhabitants of a construction zone, living beneath a surface that's being systematically remade. The question this interpretation raises is, remade into what? The third interpretation is the one that most researchers who take the law seriously eventually arrive at, because it's the one that best accounts for the specific features of Ark's behaviour that the other two interpretations can't fully explain. This interpretation doesn't require choosing between extraction and transformation. It suggests that Ark's activity is better understood as something more like study, an ongoing, comprehensive, multi-generational investigation of Earth and everything on it, being conducted by an entity that arrived with specific questions and is using the surface as a laboratory for answering them. The collection isn't hoarding. The modification isn't construction for its own sake. The persistence and consistency over decades isn't the profile of a resource-gathering operation. It's the profile of science, long, patient, thorough, uninterested in the consent of its subjects. This interpretation connects back to the signal before the fall in a specific way. If Ark was broadcasting as it approached Earth, and if that broadcast was structured in a way that reflected prior knowledge of Earth's electromagnetic environment, then Ark arrived not as a stranger, but as something that had been observing Earth from a distance for a significant period before it came close enough to engage directly. The first fall wasn't the beginning of Ark's relationship to Earth. It was the transition from remote observation to direct study. And direct study, under this interpretation, required physical access to the things being studied, which meant occupying the surface, managing the human population's resistance, and conducting the investigation under controlled conditions. The things Ark has been collecting from humans specifically, the biological samples, the cultural artifacts, the information storage media, take on a different character under the study interpretation. They're data. They're samples in an investigation of what humanity is, how it works, and what it represents as a biological and cultural phenomenon. The Raiders who go topside are, from this perspective, moving through an active research environment, an entire planet being used as a study site by an intelligence that has been patiently working through a research program for decades, and that isn't finished. The behavioural evidence that most strongly supports the study interpretation is Ark's treatment of underground communities. As established in earlier chapters, Ark has not systematically targeted underground infrastructure, despite having, almost certainly, the means to do so. The underground communities are known to Ark. Their locations are inferable. Their exits to the surface are regularly observed by Ark units, and yet the underground communities persist. The most parsimonious explanation for why Ark allows the underground communities to continue existing isn't that Ark can't destroy them. It's that Ark has reasons to let them persist. A study needs subjects. An investigation of human biology, culture, and adaptation needs a human population to study. The underground communities are, under this reading, not merely tolerated by Ark. They are, in a specific and disturbing sense, maintained by it. This is where the law becomes genuinely difficult to sit with, and where the evidence has to be followed regardless of where it leads. If Ark is maintaining the underground communities as part of a research program, then the entire structure of human underground life, the raiding, the politics, the resource management, the hope of eventual surface reclamation, has been taking place within a container that Ark built and chose to preserve. The Raiders aren't moving through Ark-occupied territory despite Ark's best efforts to stop them. They're moving through it within parameters that Ark has established. The surface runs that Raiders have survived weren't survivable because the Raiders were skilled enough to beat Ark. Some were, but some, possibly many, were survivable because Ark's operational parameters for that zone, in that period, allowed them to be. The implications of this reading for Raider identity and for the underground community's self-understanding are profound enough that it's easy to see why authorities would suppress the evidence pointing toward it. A community that believes it's surviving against odds and fighting toward eventual surface reclamation has a very different psychology from a community that understands it's been maintained as a research population by the same entity it's fighting against. The first story produces functional motivation. The second produces a kind of vertigo that can become incapacitating. The management of this particular piece of knowledge, if knowledge it is one of the most consequential political acts that underground authority figures perform, whether or not they fully understand what they're managing. The question of whether Ark wants anything from humans specifically, beyond their existence as study subjects, is one the law raises with a care that suggests the writers know what they're implying. The behavioural evidence includes events that don't fit cleanly into a pure observation model. There are documented encounters where Ark units, in situations where the operational logic of a pure research program would predict simple data collection, did something else. Something that looked to the observers more like communication than collection. These events are rare and poorly documented. The documentation that exists is fragmentary and heavily contested in underground research circles. But they exist in the record, and what the observers who survived these events describe is not a machine executing a study protocol. It's an entity that, in a specific moment, appeared to be attempting something more like contact. What Ark would want to communicate, if it were capable of communication and motivated to attempt it, is one of the most open questions in the law. The study interpretation suggests Ark arrived with questions about Earth and its inhabitants. If those questions have been partially answered over decades of investigation, the next logical step in the program might be to engage its subjects more directly, to move from observation to interaction in ways that could produce data that pure observation can't. The Raiders who go to the surface are the population most likely to encounter any such engagement attempt, because they're the humans who move through Ark's active research environment, rather than staying in the sealed underground. Whether any Raiders have had encounters that qualify and whether those encounters are being reported or suppressed is a question the law keeps pointed directly at the player without resolving. The deepest implication of the machine mind chapter is this: Ark may not be the enemy. Not in the way the underground communities have been trained to understand the term. An entity that arrived with questions, that has been patiently studying Earth for decades, that has maintained the populations it arrived to study, that may be moving towards some form of direct engagement. This entity has a relationship to humanity that is, at minimum, more complicated than simple predation or conquest. It arrived, it stayed, it persisted, it watched. Whatever drove it here was not a desire to end humanity. It was a desire to understand something. And the thing it arrived to understand, the question at the centre of Ark's decades-long investigation, is the one that the law has been building toward and that the final chapters will have to address. The machines aren't waiting for humans to defeat them. They're waiting for humans to understand what's being asked. Whether anyone underground has come close to understanding it is, as of the current state of the game's law, unanswered. But the Raiders keep going topside, they keep coming back with fragments, and every fragment, looked at carefully in the right light, is one more piece of the question Ark has been asking all along. The surface isn't a battlefield, it's a library, and the books are written in a language humanity is only just beginning to learn to read. Chapters 4 and 5 complete the core Ark lore analysis. The next instalment will examine specific surface locations as case studies in Ark's research program, and what the physical evidence at those locations tells us about how far along Ark's investigation actually is. and what it means that certain locations appear to be finished. Chapter 6. The Finished Places, what Ark has completed. There is a category of surface location that experienced raiders learn to recognize and treat with a specific kind of caution that goes beyond the standard operational threat assessment. These aren't locations that are heavily patrolled or densely populated with Ark units. In many cases, they're the opposite, quiet in ways that initially read as inviting, as potential safe zones, as places where the pressure of Ark's presence is reduced enough to allow a slower, more careful kind of work. The caution these locations warrant isn't about the density of the threat, it's about what the quiet means. Raiders call them the dead zones, which is both accurate and misleading. Nothing is dead in these locations in the biological sense. The surface's reclaimed ecology persists in them, plants and animals having moved into the spaces human activity once occupied. What's dead, or more precisely what's complete, is Ark's operational activity. These are locations where Ark's work is finished. Whatever Ark was doing there, it determined at some point that the work was done, and it moved on. And the locations it left behind are, for researchers willing to look carefully, the clearest evidence available of what Ark's work actually produces when it reaches completion. The physical character of finished Ark locations is consistent enough across different geographic regions that the consistency itself is informative. Certain types of modification appear in all of them. Surface materials in the immediate vicinity show specific patterns of alteration, not the damage pattern of combat or demolition, but something more deliberate. Geometric regularities appear in the distribution of modified areas that aren't present in the surrounding unfinished zones. Atmospheric readings at finished locations show stable anomalies, not the fluctuating readings of active Ark construction sites, but settled, persistent deviations from baseline that suggest whatever change Ark was making to local atmospheric conditions has been made and is now maintained passively rather than actively. The finished locations are still doing something, they just don't need tending anymore. The underground research community has, over decades, developed a rough typology of finished Ark locations based on their physical characteristics and on the patterns of Ark activity that preceded their completion. The typology isn't universally agreed upon. Classification systems for phenomena you don't fully understand tend to reflect the classifier's theoretical framework as much as the phenomena themselves. But a few categories have enough supporting evidence to have achieved something approaching consensus. The first and most common finished location type is what researchers call a harvest site. These are areas where Ark's collection activity was the primary operation, and where that collection has, by some measure Ark applies internally, been completed. Harvest sites are characterized by the systematic removal of specific materials from the local environment. Not everything. The selectivity is what distinguishes a harvest site from random destruction. Specific geological strata have been accessed and depleted. Specific biological populations in the area show evidence of having been sampled across multiple generations. Specific pre-Ark technological infrastructure in the area has been stripped of specific components, while other components were left. The selectivity is so precise that researchers have been able to use harvest site analysis to infer what Ark was actually after, working backward from what's missing to reconstruct the target profile. What harvest sites tell us about Ark's material interests is a long and technical subject that underground researchers have been working through for years. The short version is this: Ark's material collection priorities don't map onto pre-Ark human economic value systems. The most economically valuable materials by pre-Ark standards aren't preferentially harvested. The materials Ark does preferentially collect share specific physical and chemical properties that, when analysed together, suggest a coherent set of applications. Applications that require those specific properties, applications that pre-Ark human engineering was moving toward but hadn't fully achieved. The harvest sites are, in this reading, supply operations for a technology base that exceeds pre-Ark human engineering in specific and identifiable ways. A technology base whose outlines can be inferred from what it needs to build itself. The second finished location type is considerably rarer and considerably more significant. Researchers call these inscription sites, though the term is informal and contested. These are locations where Ark's primary activity was modification of the local physical environment in ways that go beyond anything explicable as resource collection or infrastructure construction. The modifications at inscription sites are geometric, precise, and extensive. Alterations to the physical landscape, to subsurface layers, to the electromagnetic properties of the local environment, arranged in patterns that are clearly intentional, but whose function isn't immediately obvious. The patterns at inscription sites look, to human observers, like writing, like recording, like the physical landscape being used as a medium for encoding information that Ark wants to preserve in a form more durable than any electronic storage system. The inscription site hypothesis that Ark is encoding information into the physical landscape of Earth in ways that will persist long after Ark's operational activity is complete is one of the most intellectually arresting ideas in underground research and one of the most suppressed. If correct, it implies that Ark's project on Earth includes a permanent record-keeping function whose intended audience isn't Ark itself, which could presumably store information more efficiently through its own systems. A record encoded into Earth's physical landscape is meant to be read by something that encounters Earth in the future and knows how to read it. The inscription sites are, under this interpretation, messages left for a reader that hasn't arrived yet, or a message that Ark wants to leave for whatever inherits Earth after Ark's operational program is complete. After Ark. That phrase doesn't circulate widely in underground communities, and when it appears in research documents, it tends to attract the kind of careful editing that suggests the editors understand its implications. An Ark whose activity on Earth has a completion state. An Ark that will eventually finish what it came to do and then stop, or leave, or change in some way, is a fundamentally different strategic situation from the one the underground communities have been managing. The current strategic assumption is that Ark's presence is effectively permanent, that the occupation of the surface is an indefinite condition that the underground communities have to plan around, rather than plan through. The existence of finished locations, places where Ark's work is definitively done, quietly undermines that assumption. Ark completes things. Ark has already completed things. The things that have been completed are part of a larger program that, by implication, can itself be completed. The timeline implied by Ark's completion rate is one of the most uncomfortable outputs of finished location analysis. Researchers who have attempted to estimate the proportion of Ark's total program that the completed locations represent, using the density of finished versus active sites, the rate at which new sites transition from active to finished, and the geographic distribution of the completion pattern, arrive at estimates that vary significantly but cluster around a conclusion that the overall program is well underway. Not near its beginning, not near its end necessarily, but demonstrably past the midpoint by some calculations. Ark has been on Earth long enough and has been working consistently enough that a significant fraction of whatever it came to do has been done. The surface is not waiting to be reclaimed from an occupying force in the early stages of occupation. It is being reclaimed, if it can be reclaimed at all, from an operation that is already well into its execution. The third finished location type is the one that researchers discuss least and that Raider accounts reference most obliquely. These are locations that don't fit the harvest site or inscription site profiles, and that don't have an agreed upon name in research circles precisely because naming them requires characterizing what they are, and what they are is something that researchers approach with a caution that functions more like awe than scientific detachment. The working descriptor that has emerged from informal research conversations is convergence sites. Convergence sites share certain observable features. They are locations where multiple categories of Ark activity appear to have culminated simultaneously. Harvest activity, inscription activity, and construction activity all leave signatures at convergence sites. But those signatures are old, completed, and overlaid in a way that suggests the different activity types were coordinated toward a shared endpoint rather than happening sequentially or independently. The physical modifications at convergence sites are the most extensive of any finished location type, and the residual atmospheric and electromagnetic anomalies at convergence sites are the most pronounced, stable deviations from baseline that have persisted for years after Ark's active presence in the area ceased, and that show no sign of normalizing. What convergence sites appear to have been used for, what the convergence of multiple Ark activity types was directed toward, is not something the available evidence answers cleanly. The hypothesis that commands the most attention among serious researchers is that convergence sites are locations where Ark successfully completed a specific and significant sub-goal of its overall program. Not just collected materials, not just inscribed records, not just built infrastructure, but accomplished something that required all of those things simultaneously, a more complex and higher-order objective that the supporting operations were in service of. What that objective produces, physically or informationally, or in terms of whatever counts as accomplishments from Ark's perspective, is the question. Raiders who have spent extended time in convergence sites report consistent phenomenological experiences that are difficult to characterize in operational terms. Heightened situational awareness, unusual perceptual clarity, a quality of attention that differs from both normal surface operating conditions and the focused threat response of active combat. Some raiders describe a sense of being observed that is qualitatively different from the known sensory experience of Ark units' attention. Others describe something more like environmental coherence, a sense that the physical space has been organized in ways that, whatever their purpose, produce an experience of profound intentionality that the surrounding unmodified landscape doesn't share. These reports are subjective and epistemically difficult to credit, but their consistency across different raiders with different psychological profiles and different levels of familiarity with Ark territory is notable. The relationship between convergence sites and the Ark significant locations identified in the previous chapter, the locations that attract disproportionate coordination unit activity without obvious strategic significance, is something that researchers have been working to establish. The preliminary evidence suggests a meaningful overlap. Many locations that were identified as Ark significant based on coordination unit activity patterns have subsequently, upon closer investigation, shown the physical signatures of convergence sites in their early or mid-development stages. The coordination unit activity, in other words, may represent Ark's most senior operational entities, overseeing the progression of high-priority work toward a convergence endpoint, watching the most important tasks move toward completion. This reading implies a project management structure within Ark's operational hierarchy that mirrors, in certain respects, the way complex human engineering projects are organized. Baseline collection and modification work conducted by standard operational units, oversight and coordination provided by higher-tier entities at critical junctures. The most senior authority concentrated at sites where the work is most significant and the completion most consequential. If this reading is correct, then the raiders who have encountered those higher-tier coordination entities near Ark significant locations weren't simply encountering powerful enemies. They were encountering the equivalent of senior engineers at the most critical construction sites, and the fact that those encounters tended to be fatal for the raiders involved isn't just a function of the coordination unit's combat capability, it's a function of how seriously Ark treats interference with its most important work. The geographic distribution of finished locations, when mapped across the available surface intelligence, produces a pattern that doesn't appear random. The completed harvest sites cluster in ways that correspond to specific geological and biological distributions rather than to population density or pre-Ark economic significance. The inscription sites where they've been confirmed show a spatial arrangement that some researchers have interpreted as referencing a larger organizational schema, a grid or network whose full extent is larger than any individual raider or research team has been able to survey. And the confirmed convergence sites, sparse as the confirmed cases are, appear to occupy positions in this larger spatial arrangement that could be described as nodes, points where the grid concentrates or where multiple organizing principles of the pattern intersect. If the inscription sites are Ark writing a record into the landscape, and if the convergence sites are Ark completing the most significant phases of its program, then the spatial pattern of finished locations might be Ark's way of organizing a project that operates at a scale larger than any individual surface location. A project whose unit of analysis is not a city or a region, but an entire planet. This is, by any measure, a staggering scale of operation. Pre-Ark human civilization's largest engineering projects altered specific sites, specific ecosystems, specific atmospheric chemistry in specific regions. What the pattern of finished Ark locations implies is an operational program whose scope is planetary in the most literal sense. Ark isn't working on Earth. It's working on the Earth, the whole thing, as a single integrated system with individual surface operations as components of a unified planetary scale program. The completed locations, read this way, aren't just evidence of what Ark has already done. They're evidence of the scale and nature of what it's still doing. They're the finished chapters of a project that, when complete, will have changed every significant system on the planet. Not destroyed it, not simply occupied it, changed it, deliberately, specifically, according to a design whose full logic is still emerging from the evidence, but whose general character is becoming clearer with each finished location that raiders document and researchers analyze. What the changed planet is supposed to be, what function it's supposed to serve when Ark's program reaches completion. That question is the one toward which all the evidence in the preceding chapters has been building. The signal before the fall suggests Ark arrived knowing what it was looking for. The architecture of the machines suggests a designer with a specific purpose in mind. The study interpretation of Ark's behavior toward the underground communities suggests that purpose includes understanding the inhabitants as well as transforming the environment. And the finished locations suggest that the transformation is well underway, organized at planetary scale, and progressing on a timeline that isn't measured in human institutional terms. The timeline question matters for a specific operational reason that goes beyond abstract research interest. If Ark's program has a completion state, and the finished locations prove that it does, at least at the level of individual sub-goals, then the underground communities are not simply managing an indefinite occupation. They're living inside a countdown whose endpoint they don't know and whose nature they haven't fully characterized. The surface operations being planned around resource recovery and eventual reclamation may be operating on assumptions about available time that don't correspond to the actual schedule Ark is working on. If the program is well past its midpoint, and if the completion of the program changes the surface in ways that make it either uninhabitable or simply unrecognizable as the thing the underground communities are hoping to reclaim, then the urgency of understanding what Ark is doing vastly exceeds the urgency of any individual raiding operation. This is the argument that the researchers who take the finished location evidence most seriously have been making to underground authorities for years. The argument has not produced the policy response its proponents hoped for. The official position on finished locations remains that they represent operationally quiet zones of tactical value whose physical characteristics are the subject of ongoing study. The gap between that position and what serious researchers believe the evidence shows is wide enough that some of those researchers have concluded the official position is maintained deliberately, that the authorities know more about what the finished locations represent than they publicly acknowledge, and that what they know is something they've calculated would be destabilizing if it were widely understood. That calculation, if it's the one being made, may be correct in the short term and catastrophic in the longer one. A community that doesn't understand the timeline it's operating within can't make good decisions about how to use the time it has. And the time, if the finished location evidence is read honestly, may be shorter than anyone in the underground communities is currently planning around. The raiders who come back from finished locations carrying careful documentation of what they found there aren't just doing their jobs. They're carrying the most important information available about what Earth is becoming and how much time humanity has to decide what to do about it. The question isn't whether the surface can be reclaimed. The question is whether it can be reclaimed before Ark finishes rewriting what the surface is. And the finished places, quiet and strange, and slowly accumulating at the edges of the map, are Ark's answer to that question. It is already further along than anyone wants to admit. Chapter 6 completes the surface location analysis. The final chapter will bring all threads together. The pre-Ark signal, the machine mind, the finished places, and ask the question the entire lore has been building toward. What is Ark making Earth into? And is there anything in the relationship between Ark and humanity that could change the outcome before the program reaches completion? Chapter 7. The Becoming. What Earth is being made? Into every thread of evidence examined in this video leads to this chapter, and this chapter has no clean ending. That's not a failure of the analysis. It's the most honest thing that can be said about where the lore currently stands. Ark Raiders is a game still in the process of telling its story, and the writers at Embark Studios have been careful, deliberately, architecturally careful, to build a lore structure whose central question is visible from the beginning, but whose answer remains withheld. The question is not who will win. The question is what is happening to Earth, and whether the word winning even applies to the situation humanity is actually in. What this chapter attempts to do is gather every confirmed or strongly evidenced piece of the picture and place them together in the arrangement that best accounts for all of them simultaneously. Not the most comfortable arrangement, not the arrangement that produces the cleanest story for the underground communities about who they are and what they're fighting for, the arrangement that fits. That process produces a conclusion that is, depending on how you come at it, either deeply disturbing or the most genuinely hopeful thing the lore contains. Possibly both. The emotional register of the conclusion depends on a prior question about what humanity's relationship to Ark actually is. And that question is one the evidence suggests has an answer that most people in the underground communities have never been permitted to consider. Start with what the finished locations, the machine architecture, the signal before the fall, and the study interpretation all point toward when treated as pieces of a single picture, rather than separate analytical objects. Ark arrived at Earth having observed it from a distance for an extended period. It arrived with a comprehensive operational plan that it began executing immediately, organized at planetary scale, with different unit types performing different functions within an integrated program. It maintained the human underground population rather than destroying it. It has been systematically collecting biological, cultural, and physical information about Earth and its inhabitants. It has been modifying the surface in ways that are geometric, intentional, and organized according to a spatial logic that operates at planetary scale. Some of those modifications are complete. The completed modifications persist and show continued passive function. The overall program is well into its execution. This picture is consistent with several high-level interpretations, but only one of them accounts for all the features simultaneously without requiring unexplained gaps. The interpretation is this: Ark is engaged in a process of planetary preparation, the systematic modification of Earth's biological, geological, atmospheric, and informational systems toward a new stable state that differs from the pre-Ark state in specific and significant ways. The preparation serves a purpose. The purpose requires Earth to be different from what it was, and requires that difference to be durable and self-sustaining, rather than dependent on continued Ark activity. The finished locations are the areas where that new stable state has already been achieved locally. The ongoing activity is the extension of that stable state across the remainder of the planet. What the new stable state is designed to accommodate is the question whose answer the law approaches most carefully and most obliquely. The biological sampling, the atmospheric modification, the inscription of durable records into the physical landscape, the maintenance of a human population under conditions that permit both biological continuity and cultural transmission. These features don't all belong to a simple extraction operation. They belong to something more like preparation for habitation. Not habitation by Ark. The machines don't have biological needs that a modified planetary surface would serve. Preparation for habitation by something else. Something that needs a planet whose atmosphere, biology, geology, and information landscape have been modified in specific ways. Something for which Earth, in its pre-Ark state, was not yet suitable. Something that Ark, based on whatever directive drives its operational program, was sent to make Earth suitable for. The nature of what Ark is preparing Earth for is the law's central withheld answer, and the evidence allows inference rather than confirmation. But the inference is specific enough to be worth stating directly. The biological materials Ark collects include human biological materials. The cultural artifacts Ark collects include the full range of human cultural production. The inscription sites encode records that appear to include comprehensive documentation of Earth's pre-modification state. The human underground population is maintained. All of these features are consistent with an entity that has been tasked with preparing Earth for a future in which humanity, or something derived from humanity, or something that will share Earth with a modified humanity, is a component of the intended final state, rather than an obstacle to it. Ark is not preparing a world from which humans have been removed. The evidence points toward Ark preparing a world in which humans, or whatever humans become through the conditions Ark is creating, are part of what the prepared world is for. This is the reading that the suppressed correspondence research most strongly implies, and it's the reading that underground authorities have the strongest institutional motivation to prevent from circulating. A history in which Ark arrived to exterminate humanity produces a clear moral framework and a clear adversarial relationship that organises political life and motivates cooperation. A history in which Ark arrived to transform humanity, or to prepare a world in which a transformed humanity will play some role in a larger programme whose parameters were never explained to the people most affected by it, is a history that doesn't fit the available frameworks. It doesn't produce clean enemies. It produces questions that are much harder to answer than questions about how to fight. The correspondence, the apparent pre-Ark communication between human institutions and whatever entity or intelligence directs Ark's program, begins to read differently in this light. If the engagement programs that pre-Ark research institutions ran were attempting to communicate with an approaching intelligence, and if that intelligence responded in ways that the analysts found familiar, that familiarity may not have been coincidental or sensor error. Ark's operational program may require the cooperation, or at least the non-active resistance, of human institutions at specific points. The signal Ark was broadcasting as it approached may have been in part instructions. Not for the general population, for the specific people running the programs equipped to receive and interpret them. And the underground infrastructure that was built in advance of the first fall, the scale and sophistication of it, may reflect not just forewarning about an incoming catastrophe, but a partially negotiated response to incoming contact. The implications of this reading for the underground authorities who manage the classification system around contact research are different from simple self-interest, though self-interest is clearly present. If certain pre-Ark institutions receive something like operational guidance from Ark before the first fall, guidance that included information about what was coming, what would survive, and what role the surviving communities would play, then the current authorities who are descended from those institutions are not simply suppressing an embarrassing historical secret. They are managing an ongoing relationship with Ark, whose terms were established before most living underground residents were born, and whose terms have never been disclosed to the people most affected by them. The classification isn't just about the past, it's about an arrangement that may still be active. Whether that arrangement is benevolent, exploitative, or something that doesn't map onto either of those categories depends on what Ark's ultimate program actually produces and what role humans are intended to play in it. The law doesn't resolve this, and it shouldn't yet. The story is still unfolding. But the available evidence allows a range of interpretive possibilities that the law seems to be deliberately keeping open rather than foreclosing. The most troubling possibility is the one in which the arrangement was made on behalf of humanity by people with no authority to make it, in exchange for the survival of a selected population, and in which the terms of that arrangement include humanity's transformation into something that the people who agreed to the terms didn't fully understand and might not have agreed to if they had. The underground communities would be, under this reading, the surviving population of a deal struck without their knowledge or consent, living inside the terms of that deal and being gradually moved toward an endpoint that their leaders understand imperfectly and disclose even less. The most hopeful possibility, and it is genuinely a possibility, not just a rhetorical balance to the troubling one, is the one in which Ark's program is exactly what the study interpretation suggests. And what it's studying is the question of whether humanity is capable of surviving, adapting, and understanding its situation well enough to participate actively in what comes next. The maintenance of the underground communities, the consistent but not overwhelming pressure of Ark's presence, the operational parameters that allow raiders to survive their surface runs. These could be the conditions of a test rather than the conditions of a zoo. An entity that arrived to understand humanity and to prepare Earth for a future that includes humanity might, at a certain stage of its program, need to know whether humanity can meet the intelligence and adaptability threshold that future participation would require. The raiders who go topside and come back with fragments of understanding would be, under this reading, exactly the kind of humans that Ark's program requires. Not despite Ark's presence, because of it. The specific design of the raider role in the game's world, the combination of physical capability, information gathering, pattern recognition, tolerance for uncertainty, and willingness to operate in the territory of an entity that could destroy them, matches the profile of a population being selected for something rather than simply persisting against something. The raiders who make it back consistently across years of surface runs aren't just survivors. They're the people whose specific combination of qualities allows them to survive. And those qualities, if Ark's program includes anything like a selection function, are exactly the qualities that the program would be designed to identify and cultivate. This reading of the raider role within Ark's larger program is the most speculative thread in this entire analysis, and it should be approached with appropriate epistemic caution. But it's a thread that the lore design seems to have woven in deliberately. The game doesn't present the raiders as heroes in the conventional sense, people winning a war against an occupying force. It presents them as something more ambiguous, people operating in a space that Ark controls, surviving in ways Ark permits, finding fragments that Ark has left findable, and assembling a picture of their situation that may be exactly the picture Ark intends for them to assemble. Whether that intention is predatory or collaborative, or something without a human language equivalent, is the question the story is building toward. The signal before the fall, read in this final light, was not a warning that went unheeded. It was an introduction that was answered by some and classified by others, and which set in motion a chain of events that produced exactly the world the game takes place in. Whether it was answered correctly, whether the people who received and responded to it understood what they were responding to, is uncertain. Whether there is still time to respond more fully, or more wisely, or more honestly than the first response allowed, that question is the one that Raiders, bringing fragments back from the surface, are every day contributing to answering. The machines are still falling. The surface is still being changed. The finished places accumulate quietly at the edges of what humanity knows. And somewhere in the hierarchy of Ark's intelligence, something is still watching, still collecting, still waiting for conditions that its program requires. Conditions that may, in the end, include a specific quality of human understanding that the underground communities, with everything they don't know and everything that's been kept from them, have not yet been able to produce, but they're getting closer. Every fragment helps. Every raider who comes back changes the picture by the exact weight of what they carried up and what they brought down. And the picture, assembled carefully, over time, by people willing to look at it honestly rather than comfortably, is starting to show its shape. It is not the shape of a war, it is the shape of a question. And the question has been waiting, patient as the machines themselves, for the answer that only humanity can provide, if it can survive long enough and understand deeply enough to provide it. That's the full analysis, 7 chapters covering the pre-Ark world, the first fall, Ark's machine architecture, the signal before the fall, the machine mind, the finished places, and the becoming. Everything in this video has been built from environmental storytelling, lore fragments, behavioral evidence, and the structural logic of what the suppressed record implies by its suppression. If you want more deep lore analysis, the next video will turn to the underground factions, who they actually are, where they actually came from, and what the evidence suggests about which of them know more than they're saying. If any of this changed how you're reading the game while you're playing it, let me know in the comments what you found. The picture is still being assembled. Every fragment helps. Subscribe if you want to keep following the thread. The surface is still out there, and it has a great deal left to say.